Hello and welcome to yet another episode of The Big Rishi, the TLDR podcast where we cover the first 100 days of Rishi Sunak's premiership. We're on day 91, so only a few days left to go, and I am here with Ben Blissett. What's your job?
TLDR lead writer.
UK lead writer, yeah. And Rory Taylor.
Social media coordinator.
Nice, very smooth.
Hello.
And today I think we basically have two topics that we want to talk about. We'll see where the conversation takes us, but the two topics we want to talk about today are Nadhim Zahawi, currently Minister without portfolio, who's just been, if I'm right, he's just been charged by HMRC.
Yes, it's just come out that he had to pay a penalty.
It's just come out that he had to pay a penalty. And Boris Johnson, who is always in the headlines, this time because it turns out he took out a credit facility of about £800,000 while he was Prime Minister. And it was arranged slightly dodgily. So let's start with Zahawi. Ben, do you just want to run us through what's happened with Zahawi? What do we know about it?
Yeah, so this actually happened last year. All of this sort of happened while he was Chancellor, or, he just finished being Chancellor. So it sort of spanned through last year, his dealings with HMRC. But all of this actually relates to, I don't know how many people know this, but he set up YouGov, which is a huge polling company in the UK, which does a lot of really good work. But he was one of the founders of YouGov. Now, it relates to his shares in the company. So originally, it was founded in 2000. He got 42.5% shares in the company. Now, instead of taking those personally, he had those shares put into a trust fund known as Balshaw Investments. That's his family's trust fund. And that's where the problems sort of begin. Now, this trust fund is registered in Gibraltar, which doesn't have the equivalent of capital gains tax. So he didn't have to pay any, it's been estimated by a very well educated and very good at this story. He's called Dan Needle. So he did a lot of the investigation into this story. He estimated that Zahawi saved about £3.7 million in having those shares issued in Balshaw Investments, which are registered in Gibraltar rather than in the UK. Now, in his investigations, he started to have a dialogue with Zahawi, trying to ask why
This is Dan Needle.
This is Dan Needle. Dan Needle had a dialogue with Zahawi, asking him why were these shares put in Balshaw Investments.
Do we know who Dan Needle works for?
Or
is he an independent journalist?
He
tax something.
Yes, he runs a website called taxpolicy.org.
There we go.
So he does, but he's been looking into, and all of his investments have been investigation has been written up very well on that website. So
that's a free plug for Danny Needle.
And investigator, I think.
Okay, nice.
So he started to ask why were these shares issued to Balshaw Investments. So his first argument, because his father is basically very involved in the trust fund, so it's all to do with why his father got, because he has control over he has a lot of control over this trust fund. Why does his father have all these shares? His the first argument that he made was that he provided startup capital. Now, Dan Needle found out that firstly, this all relates to a £7,000 figure that was paid early on, and it may have not actually been paid as a startup, because it may have been paid about 2 years after the company was founded. And not only that, but COP, this person called, his first name escapes me, but he paid about £287,500 for 15% of the company.
So you wouldn't expect to get 42.5% of the company for £7,000.
Okay. You'd expect to get less than 1%. So you're underselling your shares at that point. Then Zahawi sort of moves on and disregards that argument and says that his father provided him with a lot of assistance with setting up the company, because Nadhim Zahawi had never run a company before, so his father had helped him, which is understandable. Any father probably would do that. But for all of your for 42.5% of the company, which is valued at quite a lot of money, to then just be completely given to your father in return is huge. And that also begs the question: if that then makes it an exchange, doesn't it? That you're providing services for a value. And if that's the case, then VAT has to be applied on that. And when we're talking about 42.5% of a company that's has a lot of money already been put into it, that comes out at quite a lot. So there's a lot of questions that had been asked. The slightly embarrassing thing for Nadhim Zahawi is that his lawyers sent some letters to Dan Needle expecting them and wanting them to remain private. Dan Needle looked into this and found out you could actually publish them, and we actually have. He's published them, and we've got copies of those, and they are awful. They're just terrible. They're absolutely awful. Some of the just snotty phrases that are in there. However, our client considers that you overstepped the mark today by accusing him of lying to the media and public in explaining the contributions of his father to YouGov. And there's a few other things in there as well. Just one other thing that I should have brought up a little bit earlier as well is that Nadhim Zahawi, when this all first came out last year and Dan Needle started his investigation, went on the record a number of times saying that he didn't personally benefit from the trust at all. It then came out that he received a £99,000 dividend from the trust. So that's where this accusation of lying comes from.
It's peanuts.
Is that he said I haven't benefited from the trust, and then it came out that he got £99,000 from the trust.
Yeah.
So that's where the term Nadhim Zahawi's lied about this has come from.
It also feels like he's sort of lied in that he originally said it was a start-up thing,
yes.
and he switched his story to say it was his father.
Switching the story is remarkable as well.
It might not count as a outright lie, but it feels at least a little dishonest.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a bit of back and forward about some people who started who were involved when it had first started, and the involvement of Nadhim Zahawi's father. Dan Needle has a couple of people who were working there originally said they never saw him, never had any knowledge of him, going on the record saying that the company YouGov has had no involvement with his father and continues not to. There are some other people that the lawyers have brought out saying that that they recall that he helped somewhat. But the whole point with all of this is it's particularly embarrassing. It's the fact that these letters are embarrassing, the fact that Nadhim Zahawi has used lawyers to try and hush people up and try and get them to stop, threaten them into silence is a great phrase for it, exactly, is not very good. And the fact that it's now been revealed. So what's happened this week is it's come out that Nadhim Zahawi had to pay a fine to HMRC, a penalty to HMRC. He had to pay it last year, potentially even when he was Chancellor, for this whole saga. So it's only just been revealed that had happened. This hasn't happened in the last few weeks. It's just come out in the last few weeks.
Do we know how much the fine was?
We don't know exactly how much, but there is some speculation it's about £5 million. So potentially, because you'd expect to
pay. What I saw was that it was... So the overall thing was a settlement. So obviously he had to pay the tax he already owed.
Yeah.
So he did that, and then on top of that, there was a 30% penalty.
Exactly.
And the total of that came to just under £5 million.
Exactly that.
Okay. Awesome.
So which works out with the figures that Dan Needle came up with as well, because if he avoided about £3.7 million, brings it up to about roundish £5 million.
Again, peanuts, for all of us. And I guess that's the bit that cuts through, isn't it? It's the fact that he's had to pay a penalty for what feels a lot like, I don't know what the technical term is, but feels a lot like tax evasion as a Chancellor. And that's this sort of irony. It just feels very sleazy, doesn't it?
The man in charge of the country's finances and in charge of HMRC, technically negotiating and then paying a penalty to HMRC for not paying enough tax. If you're just a regular person and you underpay your tax, they'll be pretty prompt in getting you to make sure you pay it in full.
I mean, obviously, politics this aren't great. I mean, it's a bad story in and of itself, but in the context of Sunak's sort of implicit crackdown on Tory sleaze, it looks a little bit silly, doesn't it? So what do you think Sunak is going to do about this? I mean, the obvious move would probably be to sack him. And I think in normal conditions, that's what you'd expect. He's currently Minister without portfolio, but he is still in Cabinet and he is Chairman of the Conservative Party. So you'd expect some sort of disciplinary action. Have we got any sense of what Sunak's going to do?
Well, he's already instructed his ethics advisor to look into the matter. So there's a sort of ongoing investigation into this. I think it's relatively well understood now that Sunak is really not happy about this. That he didn't. I think there was something that he didn't originally realise that. Was it how he lied?
Yeah, I think basically it's kind of been going on since last week, and it's this classic thing where the government will say things about the story and then more things will come out, and it's like, well, I wish we knew that before we said the thing we just said. And there are reports that Sunak is kind of unhappy about the way things have gone. But we are at the point now where there is this investigation. So actually, all we're saying now is we'll wait for that investigation to finish.
It's a classic move, isn't it?
It is
classic
a classic
government move. Got to wait for Sue Gray.
And all the opposition parties have obviously said that Zahawi should resign. Some people have said he should just step aside while the investigation takes place. He says he's not going to do that. He said that it would be improper to talk more about the subject while the investigation is ongoing, which is very convenient.
I think he's actually got quite lucky, Zahawi, because if this had come out when he was Chancellor, he would have had to have resigned in disgrace. Had to resign in disgrace when he was Chancellor.
Instead, he had such a sort of brilliant stint.
And this all sort of was happening when he was Chancellor. So that was a very real possibility. Plus the fact that it's kicking the can down the road, isn't it? In calling an investigation, because as we saw with Sue Gray, it just meant that the government can deflect while the investigation's ongoing, and then they've kind of got their fingers crossed, and Zahawi will have his fingers crossed that this won't be as much of a story by the time the conclusions are
deal with
around.
it at some point, won't they?
Yeah.
But I find it strange that Zahawi, of everyone in cabinet, Zahawi, I mean, he's well known, but he's not. You'd think you could get rid of him fairly easily without shaking up government too much, because he's minister without portfolio and chairman of the Conservative Party. He's important, but you can get rid of them fairly easily.
And does he know? Has he got as many? Does he know where the bodies are buried as much as people like Gavin Williamson did?
I don't think it's that he necessarily got leverage over him. I think the reason that he hasn't been so keen to sack him, I mean, he started this investigation, but you're right, it's a delaying tactic more than anything serious. I think the reason he's so wary of sacking him is just because he's one of the very few competent administrators left in the Tory party. And once you sack him and you go, this guy is out of line, you can't really bring him back in to become minister of something else. And when you only have so many competent ministers available, you can't really afford to do that. I think that's what the interesting thing about the story is, because you're right, in normal circumstances, sacking would be the obvious move. Sunak's personally quite grumpy with how this has panned out. It looks terrible, especially in the context of his crackdown on Sleaze and this newfound thing of integrity. But he just can't afford to, because he hasn't got enough competent MPs left.
Yeah. I think that the Tory party need to sort of invoke a one in, one out policy with scandal. So when someone's removed, bring back someone who'd been kicked out in scandal. So maybe get rid of Zahawi, bring Hancock back.
Yeah.
I think that should be it.
It's easy to forget, but Dominic Raab is still the Justice Minister and Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah.
He's currently under investigation for, behavioural issues and
bullying.
Yeah, bullying accusations, I will carefully say.
You don't want to get a scary email from some lawyers.
But
accusations.
There's just building up. There's building up of investigations now into people that at some point I guess they'll finish, but who knows when? It's not a great look.
No, it's really not. And I think Sunak's two predecessors were brought down with in scandal, but that didn't happen as the result of one scandal. It wasn't just Partygate, it wasn't just sex scandals that brought Johnson down. So Truss didn't go either just in one scandal. There was a number of different things that sort of brought her down, whether that's the fracking vote the night before she went or her disastrous mini-budget. And this Nadhim Zahawi scandal might not be something huge in of itself, but it could be one of the starter scandals, and if things like this continue to happen, they could start to build up with Sunak in the same way that it did with Truss and Johnson.
You think there's a chance of Sunak going?
I really don't. So. I think they'll just build up until the election, and it makes it more likely that they'll lose.
I think the Conservative Party would be reluctant to swap leaders.
They can't have the energy for another one, can they? I mean, that's exhausting.
Surely not. But I think you're right. Probably at the election. But
anyway, should we move on to Johnson?
Another corruption adjacent scandal.
Yeah, it is.
This is a Boris Johnson story.
Just the last, I was going to say, it'd be quite entertaining if that did bring Sunak down, and then Johnson returns, brings Johnson down.
Oh, perfect. Then Zahawi becomes leader. Or something like that. That'd be great.
He is the obvious front runner.
Yeah.
Everyone put a fiver on that. That's a good bet.
Yeah. Everyone's talking about Johnson coming back, but no one's talking about Truss.
That is true. The Truss return.
I mean, for really obvious reasons.
I know.
Anyway, shall we talk about Boris Johnson?
Yes, Boris Johnson and the BBC. So this isn't... I'm going to say it. This isn't a Rishu for Rishi Sunak specifically, but it does play into the wider...
I thought Jack not being here would mean we never had to hear that again.
People want us to say it, but it does play into the wider problem of the perception of Tory sleaze that Sunak is... he looks, increasingly like he's struggling to deal with, that is only going to damage them as we kind of run up to the next election. So this was revealed by the Times, the Sunday Times, and about a week ago they revealed this story about how Boris Johnson secured a credit facility of up to £800,000 from a distant cousin, a wealthy distant cousin of his, while he was Prime Minister.
Always nice, isn't it, to have a wealthy distant cousin with £800,000 available?
Yeah, lovely. That was while he was Prime Minister, because he apparently, for various reasons, he struggled with his finances while Prime Minister, because he was earning about £150,000.
It's more than that, isn't it? It's more like £250,000.
Oh, is it?
I think it is. I might be wrong about that.
Well, either way, he had various childcare bills and divorce settlements and quite a lot of things that added up. But a week after the Times broke this story, they then revealed that the current chairman of the board of the BBC was involved in setting up that deal between Boris Johnson and his wealthy cousin, which for all sorts of reasons is problematic. I'll run you through the timeline that the Sunday Times has developed just so you can get an idea of how this went. So the couple of names you need to know: the current BBC chairman is Richard Sharp, and Sam Blythe is this rich cousin of Boris Johnson's. Sam Blythe is also an old friend of Richard Sharp, and Blythe heard that Boris Johnson was struggling with his finances and made it clear that he was willing to act as a guarantor for the loan of up to £800,000. Richard Sharp, this was before he became the chairman of the board of the BBC. He arranged for Blythe to meet with Simon Case, who's the cabinet secretary, so that they could discuss setting up this credit facility for Johnson. Yeah. So Sharp facilitated that meeting and then says he had no further involvement other than that. That was in early December 2020. A couple of months later, or actually just 1 month later, the government announced that Richard Sharp was their preferred candidate to become the BBC chair, and he went on to become the chair of the BBC. So what it looks like, to someone who might be very cynical, it looks like Richard Sharp helped secure a big loan for Boris Johnson, and then a month later was appointed the chair of the BBC.
And he was recommended, wasn't he?
Yes.
That's how it works.
Yeah,
he was recommended by Boris Johnson. Or Johnson's government.
Yeah, Johnson.
Okay.
I think it's the culture secretary and the prime minister have to agree on it or something.
Well, it's fine, Rory, because it didn't say in the job application that they had to declare anything, conflict of interest.
This is the other thing. Sharp, for the record, Sharp says he, quote, simply connected people and then had no further involvement whatsoever, and he didn't discuss the personal finances at all. He just brought the people together and then stepped back. That's what he says. He says all guidelines were followed and he was appointed on merit, not because of this reason.
But the other thing is that he didn't disclose any of this, isn't there?
Yeah, so there's quite a big appointments process to become the BBC chairman. And in the actual job application that is written by the government, it says you cannot be considered for a public appointment if you fail to declare any conflict of interest. Candidates were also told to report any issues in your personal or professional history that could, if you were appointed, be misconstrued, cause embarrassment, or cause public confidence in the appointment to be jeopardised. So,
and that clearly falls under that purview.
Yeah, exactly. There's no way that thing shouldn't have been declared during his appointment. There are two bodies that kind of oversee it. One is a parliamentary committee, and one is obviously the actual interview panel that interviews the candidate. In neither of those cases did those two bodies know about Sharp's involvement in setting up this.
So Sharp didn't make clear to either body.
Yeah, basically he didn't disclose it. So where do we go from here? It's another case of there are investigations that have been launched. One is an internal BBC one into potential conflict of interest, and the second is the Commissioner for Public Appointments is going to review the appointment of Sharp to his role to make sure that it followed all guidelines and appropriate things they are meant to do. Again, we have no idea when these things might finish and when we might find out things, but Sharp has made clear he doesn't think he did anything wrong and that he won't step aside either while it's happening or for good. So this is it's a Boris Johnson problem, but it's not just that. It's a Rishi Sunak problem. It's a Conservative Party problem, basically.
It's a Conservative Party problem. A bit of me feels sorry for Sunak because even if he did really want to change the party's image and get rid of this toxicity, it's just endless scandals. Even ones that preceded him, but they still hit the headlines.
Yeah, the spectre of Boris Johnson is still very much present
from the grave.
Yeah. So it's possible that we could get to a point where we get a week where Nadhim Zahawi resigns and the chair of the BBC resigns. I thought that might happen this week, but it doesn't look like it now.
No, I think that's going to happen now.
Yeah.
Is that the point of the investigations, or is it doesn't happen this week?
Yeah.
So again, I think we go back to one of the main thing that amazed me about this story. Obviously, it's another Sleaze story, and it's just more dodgy headlines for the Tories. But every time this comes up, it amazes me how much Boris Johnson was struggling for money as Prime Minister.
I know.
It doesn't. It's just because in all his. In the however many years that he was working as a journalist, an author, a politician, preceding his becoming Prime Minister, you'd have expected him to build up some savings.
Yeah.
He got paid $250,000 a year for a Telegraph column that, is a couple of What was it? It was like a column a week, something like that. And he described that as chicken feed. So
Yeah.
you can assume during that time he was getting paid way more
Then he
than
got an advance for a book on Shakespeare that he hasn't written yet.
Yeah.
And also, I read that since leaving office as Prime Minister, he spent like a few months living for free in some mansion owned by some very wealthy people. And in that same time, he earned over £1 million for like 4 public speeches. I don't know
where's the money going.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
also,
unbelievable.
I mean, not just in government or in the civil service, but in most professions, you would not hire someone who was broke to the tune of £800,000, who required an £800,000 credit facility just because they're too open to financial pressure and to external leverage. And the fact that like the Prime Minister of the country was borrowing money hand over foot from all these random people and also taking massive donations.
This is exactly why you pay politicians a reasonable amount. I know that every now and then the issue of MP pay gets brought up and how much the Prime Minister gets paid and everything. But like the amount that, what is it, 120, 130K's
I think that's a ministerial one. I need to check.
Or maybe it's slightly more, but that's a reasonable amount to live
agreeing
on
this. Yeah, exactly. Like an MP, I think it is genuinely difficult sometimes to. I mean, it's not a cheap lifestyle, and also 80k a year. It puts you in top 5% of earners, but it's not the sort of money they can be making in the private sector. So I'm sympathetic to that argument.
Yeah.
But prime ministers, I think it's we find out what a prime minister makes. Is
about
it
160,000?
Oh, it's only 160,000. I was wrong about that. But 160k a year, that's quite a lot of
Exactly.
money.
Yeah.
That should get you through.
But that's why they pay that high amount.
You get your house provided.
Yeah, and you get a house provided, so you're not paying rent or anything with that.
Yeah.
But it's so that you're not subject to external financial pressure, and it's exactly that. With that sum, you shouldn't be struggling.
I would love to see his outgoing costs. They would be phenomenal. I mean, he must have so many kids.
Yeah.
He must be paying school fees all over the place. Yeah. But that's the bit always like freaks me out, and also that's the bit that like makes me grumpiest about these stories is the fact that our Prime Minister was open to financial pressure for such a long time, and clearly it's not even that expensive. I mean, like, if you're that broke that you need to find like random credit facilities from long lost cousins, how much can you be bought out for, really?
and I'm not talking just specifically about this case, but the kind of people who give money to, I mean, donating to a politician is one thing, but providing a generous loan of up to £800,000 is, you're not doing that just out of the kindness of your heart.
No.
There's obviously some expectation for.
It feels like a sort of payday loan for posh people. Do you know what I mean? Like it's slightly vulturish. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you need £800,000? I can give it to you if you loan it against the value of your politics. Anyway,
but that's exactly it, isn't it? That is why they do it.
Yeah. There was one thing about Richard Sharp I forgot to mention. The BBC chairman. You can take what you want from this. It's kind of just interesting, though. He was a former investment banker and was Rishi Sunak's boss, I think, at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, or at least his superior, and also advised Sunak on COVID during the pandemic at one point.
God, so there are a few
little links there. Yeah,
it's just the merry-go-round of top gigs. Exactly. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Also, how does being an investment banker qualify you to be head of the BBC?
I have no idea. Yeah. But apparently,
was this the same guy that did the COVID
Prime
response?
Minister, frankly.
He was. He wasn't the advisor. I think he was involved in, some advice. I don't know exactly what that role was, but
either he's incredibly intelligent and knows a lot about a lot of different things, or, as I'm thinking is more likely, he's just very well connected.
Yeah, and he also had donated lots to the Conservative Party as well, which is another thing.
Yeah,
but I worry that some of the stuff we say on here, at some point, can we say? I just want to say all of what I just said, but with allegedly just in a bit more.
But like, point. The government does have the right to appoint the chair of the BBC, and they do get vetted by these panels, and you hope that the panels know everything they need to know. And at the time when Sharp was appointed, the question was, this guy donated to the Conservative Party, now they want to put him in charge of the BBC. That seems a bit scandalous. That alone was scandalous, and now all of this just adds to it.
I think what's interesting is that, again, in normal times, you'd expect these sort of allegations where it's not illegal, it's just a bit sleazy, to be sort of fine, sort of passable. But the fact that we've had so many where it's not quite illegal, but it's clearly sleazy, there's clearly a bit of sort of nepotistic cronyism going on here. After a while, they feel worse than illegal things. Do you know what I mean? Like, seatbelts, who cares? It's more just that there's clearly a pattern of bending the rules and trying to sort of get away with as much as you can that just undermines trust in the government and all sort of relevant public institutions. I think the main takeaway, I think we should end on this as well, is just that quite how bad the polling has slowly got for Sunak. and all of these scandals sort of play into it. And I think the latest polling, I mean, one of you guys might know more than I do about this, but it does look like he's got about 20-point, Labour's got a 20-point lead over Sunak at the moment.
There's been any honeymoon that you might have had in the polls has not materialised.
And also, I think when Sunak first came in, we assumed that there's this massive gap between Sunak's poll ratings and the Tory party's poll ratings.
Yeah.
And I thought at least that they would converge towards Sunak's poll ratings, because that's what's historically happened. That's why with David Cameron, for example, he was more popular in this party and the poll ratings converged towards his approval rating and he won. But the reverse has happened, and I think some of it is to do with the fact that, and you wrote a video on this a while ago, Sunak has been too quiet, and that has allowed the headlines to be dominated by other stuff. But I also just think it's that what he's trying to do is to make people associate the Conservatives more with him and his sort of like clean professional brand than they do with the sort of sleaze and chaos of Truss and Johnson. But with these sort of headlines, you're just not going to make any progress on that front. And I do think people just continue to associate it with the polls.
I think what's happening now is that he did want to do that whole slick professional thing and try and demonstrate that the Conservative Party's changed, but it just hasn't. So he's staying quiet.
Also, he hasn't got enough like slick professional guys to like provide that image. Like if you want to do a David Cameron, you have to have a couple of Osborns. Yeah, you have to have a couple of people who make it feel like actually the majority of Tory MPs pretty sensible chaps. But at the moment, he's got like just him, and it's him desperately trying to sort of like patch up little bits of the party.
I saw a tweet about the seatbelt thing, and it said the seatbelt thing on its own is not important, but it does contribute to what they call the Ed Milibandification of Rishi Sunak, which is basically the increasing image of him, the worsening image of him, and the kind of increasing feeling that people just can't take him seriously. Yeah. And whether that's like in terms of minor stuff like the seatbelt thing or inability to deal with quite serious issues, it's just bad all round. Basically.
Bad all round.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we covered everything. We covered all we wanted to cover.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a success. I think we all basically agreed that Sunak's not doing very, very well.
He's not doing well, but it's looking like he will make it to the end of the podcast in 9 days.
We called last week his week from hell, but this week feels worse.
It does.
Or an extended week from hell, I think.
Maybe we're getting towards a month from hell.
Yeah, possibly.
I think it's just the mundane crap news for him. Do you know what I mean? Like the fact that every week there's more crap news. It's quite astonishing, really. Anyway.
Wonder what next week will bring. What scandal are we going to be discussing on here next week?
Very exciting. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Bigger Issue. And we will be back in probably a couple of days. I think we've got 2 more podcasts in us, no? Yeah, in a couple of days' time for the penultimate episode.
Yeah. God, it's coming to an end very quickly.
Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to yet another issue of...
Of the Bigger Issue.
Let's try that again.
I quite like the rhyme.